So I kind of left off talking about the Articles of Confederation. They were this document that explained what the Continental Congress was going to look like. It formed a unicameral government, got funding from the states, larger states with more land, got more delegates, and also paid more money, but they didn't get any more votes. So, as they were concentrating on fighting and winning this impossible war, nobody was really paying attention to the problems with the Articles of Confederation. But remember I told you that they were giving soldiers IOUs because they really did not have the money to pay the soldiers. And they were having a serious abandonment problem. One of the people that abandoned was a guy named Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays was actually a captain, so he was in the Massachusetts militia. He was pretty high up. And when he was injured, he went home and just never went back. He didn't go back when he healed up. So the war ends, and people go back to their various states, and states continue to operate based on what they needed. In Massachusetts, they were having financial problems. And so the people that were in power in Massachusetts did a few things that sound a little odd to us today. Well, maybe not too odd. Well, one of the things that the Massachusetts government did was decided that to hold office and to be able to vote, you had to be a landowner, property owner. This rule favored the wealthy because not everybody owns property. Then they made this decision. The state banks that were part of the income of the state decided that they were going to foreclose on farms. So people were buying farms and had received loans from the state banks. And they decided that they were going to call all of the loans. So you had to pay all of the loan, not just a deficiency. And you had to pay that debt in cash. Massachusetts money, cash. But if you had been serving in the Continental Army, did you have any cash? The answer is no. What you had was a fistful of IOUs. So, Daniel Shays rounded up several people. A lot of them were farmers who were about to lose their farms. A lot of them were people that were sympathetic to the farmers that were about to lose their farms. And they decided that they were going to protest the foreclosures. Now, how did they do that? They came up with this ingenious plan. They decided to go to the courts where the foreclosure proceedings were supposed to happen and keep the judges by force from entering the courts. You can't have court, you can't foreclose. And they did this day after day after day. And people in Massachusetts were loving it. They were very sympathetic because they thought that what Massachusetts government was trying to do was not fair. So you're in Massachusetts government. How do you address this problem? You have laws in place. You can't just let chaos go on and let people make decisions for themselves and not let government proceed. How do you stop this? Well, today, what would we do? We would call the police. Yeah, there were no police. So then you would call, oh, I don't know, the military, the militia. Little problem. Most of the members of the Massachusetts militia were either engaged actively in Shays' Rebellion or they were sympathetic to the people that were engaged in Shays' Rebellion. So they're not going to respond to a government request to take up arms. They're either fighting or sympathetic. I guess you can write a letter and ask the next time that Congress meets in November that continental government send some money. Well, no, they didn't have any money. They weren't going to be meeting for quite some time. I guess the other states could get together and vote to decide to send militia people from their various states, because there was no national army. These were all just a compilation of different militias from different states that had commanders. And of course, George Washington was the ultimate commander of the Continental Army. They had appointed him back during the Second Continental Convention. So there definitely just was not going to be any help from the national government, because there really weren't any provisions in the Articles of Confederation for help like this. There were no emergency provisions. There was no money. There was no acting without having 9 states come together and vote. Everything was designed to move very slowly in Congress. So what they ended up finally doing was finding mercenaries, finding people that were willing to take money, and they fought against Shays' army. They sometimes called it Shays' army. The entire thing was called Shays' Rebellion. They also, these were people that were veterans. They didn't have a lot of money. This was Massachusetts. Eventually, people started getting sick and cold, and tired, for that matter. In the end, February 4th, 1787, this group of people were defeated, and the foreclosures were able to go on. Now, this is an artist rendering of Shays' Rebellion. But let's really, really think about this. There is definitely a problem. Really kind of toward the end of Shays' Rebellion, a group of people got together in Annapolis, Maryland. And I'm saying that very slowly because that's a fill in the blank. Annapolis, Maryland. It's sometimes called the Annapolis Convention. It was representatives from 5 states. Now, is that enough? No. How many do you have to have? 9. They had representatives from 5 states. So they weren't able to do anything official, but they did write down some recommendations. And the recommendations that they wrote basically said, we've got to do something. We're going to have to get together. We're going to have to do something. It looks like we're going to have to amend the Articles of Confederation. So even though everybody didn't come to this meeting, we're going to set another meeting and let's get together and revise the Articles of Confederation. Now, this is not binding, but It was a suggestion, and enough people eventually saw what happened in Massachusetts, were scared enough about what happened in Massachusetts, that when they did call the convention together, and there is the information about the Congress of Annapolis, Maryland. When they did call everybody together, and they got together in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, they had a quorum. There were representatives of many states, and some of them were elected representatives, some of them were not. Benjamin Franklin was not an elected representative, but he was a delegate to this constitutional convention, they eventually called it. Alexander Hamilton represented the state of New York, and they got together and said, well, what they did in Annapolis wasn't binding anyway. We don't think that there's any way to fix the Articles of Confederation. So they decided that they were just going to throw them out and start brand new. Luckily, a guy named James Madison had done his homework and had written this document with his suggestions for how things would look. He came to the Constitutional Convention with already drafted suggestions about a new government. They did not adopt Madison's plan verbatim, but they did work through his suggestions and were like, okay, we'll do this, we won't do this, we'll tweak this, we'll change this. So they used it as a blueprint. So sometimes James Madison is called the father of the Constitution for that reason. So we're here. They are there in Philadelphia. Representatives from 13 colonies, some of them northern, some of them southern, many of them elected officials. They have this huge task in front of them. Now, they were up for the job because many of them had drafted constitutions in their various colonies and were running their now states since the Articles of Confederation had been adopted. So these were powerful white men. Most of them were landowners. Several of them were slave owners. So let's talk about what happened at the Constitutional Convention. To introduce you to something that I call Madelynism. Madelynism is something that comes out of my head. And it doesn't mean that it's not true. It's just that you're not going to see any other author writing this down because it comes from my, wealth of knowledge and experience. Let's go with that. First, Madelynism that I am going to tell you about today is this. The way that you can tell that you had a good meeting is if everybody walks out mad. Because that means that you had some disagreements and they got settled with no one person or one group walking away with everything. They had to compromise. They had to give up something. Now, by that definition, this was a great meeting. Because there was nobody that was absolutely happy with what came out of the Constitutional Convention. James Madison wasn't happy because they were picking apart his perfect little Constitution. One of the things that he had in his Constitution was something that we sometimes call the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan. James Madison was from Virginia. He would go on to be, the third president of the United States, or fourth president of the United States, because it was Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, and then Madison. So he was the fourth president of the United States. But he had this proposal. He said, look, we need to have two chambers, not just one. And just like we did in the Articles of Confederation, you get more representatives if your state is larger. And so let's do that in both the chambers. If you have a larger state, you'll have more representatives because you're going to be paying more taxes. We'll do that in both of the chambers. Now, who did not like this? Who said, you know what? Worked under the Articles of Confederation? Equal representation of states. Small states liked the fact that they were not at a disadvantage just because they were small states. Because under the Virginia plan, small states would always have fewer representatives. The large states would have complete control. And they just did not like that. So they said, here, let's do this. Let's do equal representation. Let's just have one chamber like we did under the Articles of Confederation, each state with one vote. How about that? They argued. They went to committee. They came out with different proposals. Eventually, a proposal was put on the floor, and this was the one that was adopted. We sometimes call it the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. And what they decided was that they were going to keep the Virginia plans two chambers. And they were even going to let one of the chambers be based on population and property value. So if you were a larger, more well-off state, you would have more representatives. They call that the House of Representatives. Easy. Larger you are, more representatives you have in the House of Representatives. But they also said this second chamber is going to be equal representation like the New Jersey plan. Now, we're not going to just have one, we're going to have two. Two senators from each state. But it's going to be equal. No state will get more senators, no state will get less senators. Every state has two. And any law that gets passed has to pass through both this huge House of Representatives and the Senate to actually become a law. So that was the way that they settled that issue. Large states weren't completely happy. Small states weren't completely happy. But they had come up with a workable compromise. So here we go. We had a workable compromise. But now you got another issue. The issue of representation in the House of Representatives. The word is apportionment. Apportionment means that you determine how many representatives a state is going to get based on population. Now here's the question. Who are you counting when you were determining population? You just count everybody? One little issue. Many was not as prevalent in the North. It had not been eliminated in northern states, but certainly some southern states, slaves outnumbered non-slaves 2-to-1, sometimes more than that. So many of the southern states were like, well, we want to count slaves. we want to count slaves when you're determining how many representatives, because we're going to end up having very few representatives if you don't allow us to do that. Northern states were not feeling this at all, because as they were phasing out slavery and becoming more and more anti-slavery, they just did not see how the laws of the state said that slaves were chattel, literally like cattle. They were sold. They had a value. You put the value of the slaves in your estate. You sold them. You mortgaged them. They were property, not people. And scientists had been hired to show that people from Africa were not people. So how are you going to treat them like people when it comes time to decide how many representatives you get, but still treat them like property every day? Now, what they ended up doing was coming up with something that is called the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise. This is some mess, but this is what was in the Constitution. It said that you will count 3/5 of all your enslaved population. And if they were not enslaved, then they would count as a whole person. Let me say that again. It was funny. They worked around and found a way not to say the word slave at all in the United States Constitution. So it was, you will count the whole of all free people and 3/5 of all other persons. That was the way that it wrote it down. So, here we have a way for Southern states to get more representatives. Because they're now able to count at least a portion of slave populations in apportioning how many representatives they would get. This chart shows 1790, and it shows the percentage of African Americans as a percentage of the state population. African Americans as a percentage of state populations. And so notice that in northern states, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, the numbers were relatively low. There just were not a lot of African Americans in the north. But go down to the bottom and work up. South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, even Delaware and Maryland, the numbers were much higher. Much higher. So, and we have to assume that in at least these southern states, not Delaware, but in these southern states, most of that population, that African American population, were slaves. So they came up with some other things, like they decided that they were going to have a president, and they decided that they were going to have a separate body that decided disputes. So you would have Congress, like you had in the Articles of Confederation. That would be one branch of government. Their job would be to legislate. You had the executive branch that was led by a president, one president, and then you had the judicial branch with judges that would be appointed they would be nominated by the president and then approved by the Senate.